I've discovered that quite a sizable percentage of people who watch these talks live in America, particularly the United States, some in Canada as well. So it occurred to me that it might be a good idea to select a topic which involves both Americans and English people. So what better one, what more obvious one, than the American War of Independence. So let us start right at the beginning, shall we? How did it start? I'm sure all of you either have been involved yourself or have witnessed an incident in which two children are engaged in a fight in a playground. And the teacher comes along and pulls them apart and says, "Now, come on, who started it?" What do they say? He did. Neither side will say, "Oh, no, it was all my fault. You know, it was the other chap's quite innocent." No, they don't say that. It's always the other fellow. If you went to the Near East and asked an Israeli what the cause of all the trouble was, he would say one thing. If you asked a Palestinian, he would say something completely different. If you went to Northern Ireland and said to a Protestant, "What's the cause of all the trouble?" I bet his version of it wouldn't be very much like the version given to you by a Roman Catholic if you asked him the same question. And the same thing applies here. Now, as an Englishman, I've got to be particularly careful because this event, this cause, this trouble, this topic is going to be of much more significance to Americans than it is to Englishmen. Why? Because it was out of this American War of Independence that your very country was born. You owe your existence to the result of the American War of Independence. So, as I said, I've got to be careful, particularly as I'm not American. Secondly, I'm not an expert. And I'm not telling you a blow-by-blow account. I don't intend to give you an encyclopedic account of what actually happened. I'm only making some observations. And I have been careful to consult American historians too. American historians, moreover, of great distinction. So let's go back to the beginning. Despite all the disagreements, there appears to be one point on which both sides agree. In 1763, England, Great Britain, whatever you care to call it, ruled 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America. 20 years later, in 1783, they didn't. The United States of America had been born. In between that, there is disagreement pretty well all along the line. And not 100% disagreement, funnily enough. There is a disagreement in amongst those who disagree. What I mean by that is, it was not all Americans thinking one thing and all Englishmen thinking another. When the war broke out, there were men, women, family, there were opinions, ideas in every single one of the 13 colonies which disagreed with the war. They were called, understandably, loyalists. There were areas of disagreement in every single one of the 13 colonies. By the same token, there were men in England who thought that the English government was treating the Americans, colonists as they call them, very badly, and said so very loudly. So it was felt in England that we were not treating, I don't think they used the word Americans very much because they weren't. They were Englishmen. We were not treating the English colonies properly. We were not treating them fairly. And the net result of the whole episode in 1783, it brought the government down. The divisions in England were so deep and so wide that it caused the fall of the entire English government. The English view was, and I repeat, it was quite common to call them colonists because that's where they were. People who lived in colonies were colonists. They didn't call them Americans because they regarded them as Englishmen, which they were. They were subjects of King George. If you lived under the English crown and the English government, you were English. You lived under the American government, you were American. So, excuse me, colonists, they felt, were not behaving properly. And I repeat, colonists was not used as any term of in any derogatory way. It was not used in a superior way. It was not used in an abusive way. It was simply a means of describing what they were. If you lived in colonies, you were a colonist. If you lived in England, you were an Englishman. In the same way, if you lived in Virginia, I live in Virginia, you might be proud of the fact that you're a Virginian. But at the same time, you can be proud of the fact that you're an American. Well, there were plenty of colonists in North America who were proud of the fact that they were English because they lived under King George. And it was felt, as I said, that the English government was treating the colonists badly. I'm sorry to have laboured this point, but I don't want to be caught in the trap of regarding it as a man would, as a person would from the 21st century. Let's look at it from how they saw it in the 18th century. And the English government saw the people who lived in the colonies naturally as colonists. There was no insult, no superior attitude implied at all. And they were English. Colonists, they felt, were not behaving properly, almost like naughty children. At best, they were being ungrateful. At worst, they were traitorous. From a distance, you see, England was 3,000 miles away from all this. And as you well know, the further you get away from something, the fewer the details you can see. The further you get away, the further the English were away from the colonies, the fewer differences they could see. At 3,000 miles, they were just a batch of colonists who lived in America. They didn't know much else. And as far as they could see, the Americans, the colonists, were behaving badly. They were being difficult. They were being awkward. Cussed in English, they would have used, the adjective they would have used. In America, I understand it might be ornery. The English have an adjective, which I've discovered that the Americans don't use very much, bloody-minded. But even if you've never heard the adjective before, you get an idea of the general drift of what bloody-minded means. And we felt that the Americans, the colonists, were being bloody-minded. As I repeat, we couldn't see the differences. We didn't know how Massachusetts in the north differed from Maryland in the center. We didn't know that there were nonconformists in the north and that there were Roman Catholics in the middle. We didn't know that the north specialized in timber and fishing. In the middle, they were keen on farming. In the south, of course, they grew cotton. They ran plantations. So the differences between the north and the middle and the south were vast, and we couldn't see that. We simply didn't know. In the same way, not only were they split north, centre, and south, they were split east and west as well, because the colonies on the seaboard had been there a long time. They had settled down, they had developed habits, traditions, they had become prosperous, many of them. Whereas in the west, it was very much more rough and ready. They were busy hacking a living, hacking a farm, hacking a life, hacking a civilization out of the wilderness. Of course, they're not going to see the world the same way. So they were split horizontally and they were split vertically. And again, the English couldn't see all that because we didn't know. It had never occurred to us. There were no magazines being published about America. And we had no means of finding out. So the Americans, again, rather like the English, their view was somewhat simplistic as well. To them, King George was a tyrant. That was the view of George in the traditional understanding of this controversy. And Parliament was a bully. Parliament was passing laws which was making life absolutely impossible for patriotic and sensible and reasonable Americans. They felt that it was their duty, it was their job, it behoved them. They had no alternative but to stand up for their home, for their family, for their pride, for their liberty. What better things were there to stand up for? Of course, patriotic Americans, as they saw themselves, were happy, willing, eager, many of them, to stand up for all these ideals. And so the tradition grows that the move from being bullied colonists into becoming the United States citizens in 1783 was a steady march of brave, united patriots towards inevitable and deserved victory. That is the traditional view, the legend. In fact, we are told that they enjoyed far more freedom than any other colony of any other country on the face of the earth. There were other European powers, as you probably know, France, Holland, Spain, Portugal, who had colonies all over the place. And they treated them far, far worse than the English treated the Americans. So they were better off than anybody else, perhaps better off than they realized. In the same way, you've all heard of the French Revolution in 1789, and the tempting conclusion is that the French revolted, had their revolution because they were downtrodden by the wicked aristocrats and they revolted for their freedom and their liberty. They were ground down by these wicked, nasty, blue-blooded aristocrats. But in fact, the average French peasant, we now know, was far better off than any peasant living in Prussia or Austria or Holland or Belgium or Spain or Italy or anywhere else. If you're really ground down into the soil, into the mud, you haven't got the wherewithal, you haven't got the spirit, you haven't got the money, the strength, the power, the will to resist. In order to have the will to resist, you've got to have some resources. You've got to have some source of strength. So the conclusion drawn is that the French had their revolution, not because the French were worse off than everybody else. On the contrary, they were better off than anybody else. And the same argument is applied to the American colonists as well. They had more freedom, I repeat, than anybody else belonging to any other power in the rest of the world. And if you think this is just an Englishman sounding off in an ignorant way about America, this is a conclusion drawn and put to the American public in vast history books by American historians with impeccable credentials. One of the most famous, one of the most distinguished of American historians, a man called Samuel Morrison, and he wrote an enormous book with another equally distinguished American historian, Mr. Commager. And to give you an idea of how solid their credentials are, their qualifications embrace the universities of Columbia, Amherst, Harvard, Oxford, and Cambridge. So you can't get much more distinguished than that. And this is what Mr. Morrison says. Make no mistake, the American Revolution was not fought to obtain freedom, but to preserve the freedom that the colonies already had. Independence was no conscious goal, but a last resort, reluctantly adopted to preserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice, not to obtain, but to preserve. They fought that war, not to gain liberty, but to avoid what they thought would be losing it. Goodbye.